So how many people's days go something like this? You get out of work, you walk to your car, you drink your pre-workout on the way to the gym, you put on your favorite pair of training t-shirt and shorts, you eye up that workout of the day, oh, we got heavy clean jerks followed by Metcon, like cool. And then you jump into the class warm-up, you grab that orange bar because you know that one's yours. Like you don't own it, but it's definitely yours. And then you take it over to the corner of the gym, the one where you know it is completely flat. Then you lace up those lifters, you slip into those knee sleeves, you put on the wrist wraps because everything needs to be compressed and nice and warm, right? And then at 70%, you pull out your weightlifting belt out of this huge oversized gym bag and it smells like a middle school locker room. And of course, it's going to match your knee sleeves. Okay, I think you guys get the point. I'm not going to go on, but here's the thing. You have to have structure, and structure is good. You need it. And equipment certainly has its place. But at what point does your gear go from helping you to hindering you? So today's question is your equipment a crutch?
Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver incredible training-related content to people just like you. I don't just podcast. I write in-depth fitness articles. I break down common movements in the sport of fitness. I program workout plans, and I offer one-on-one coaching for competitive and recreational athletes. And the best part is most of what I have on zorfitness.com is totally free. Check out these resources by going to zorfitness.com. That's ZOAR fitness.com. Hope to see you there.
And welcome back to my rant on the place of gear and equipment. So the outline of today is super simple. I'm just going to go through a bunch of different pieces of equipment and talk about each of them. I'll talk about if you should actually have them, what context should you use them versus not use them, so kind of best practices around that. And then if something does have value and I recommend it, what product do I personally use or do I recommend to my athletes, and why is that the case? So I think most of this conversation needs to go away from equipment and towards gear. So little things that you might have in a gym bag or a locker at your gym, where at least in someone's mind, they're aiding their performance. Whether they are long-term or not is what we're actually going to be talking about today. So figuring out what things have utility, how should we be using these things best so that we can not just, maybe optimize for a particular workout, but adapt over the long term. And those things are completely different. Optimizing is what you do in competition. It's about making everything as easy as possible, whereas adapting is about long-term growth. It's actually about change, where optimizing isn't about that at all. It's just about how easily can you get through whatever you're doing. So to look at this difference between optimization and adaptation, it might be helpful if we compare this to something like a lifting belt. So if I have an athlete and they're going to go and do a max back squat in a competition, I'm 100% going to have them wear a belt and have them pull that nice and tight and get as much of an assistance as they can because they are optimizing to get as much weight on that bar on that particular day. Whereas if I have an athlete and they have maybe a weak core and they're in the off season, I want them to adapt. So I might have them not use a belt so that they bring up their core. And temporarily, that's going to blunt the amount of weight that they can use on that particular exercise. But over the long term, that's going to create change systemically the way I want it to. So this is the conversations we're getting into. We're understanding that we want to be able to create sustainable change over the long term. That is the goal. What is the purpose of the weightlifting belt? The purpose of the weightlifting belt is so that someone can push their abs out against it and create a lot of tension so that they stay rigid while they're moving. And that way, say the person's front squatting, they're not rounding while they're front squatting because they can create more pressure against that with their abs. And that way there's no deviation when they're actually going through the movement. So they're less likely to round if they're using a belt. So my suggestion for how people are going to be using a belt, don't use that belt below 80%. So if you're front squatting, if you're going empty bar, 135, 185, 225, until you get to 80% of your 1 rep max, don't put on the belt. Once you get to that threshold or whatever that is for you, it doesn't have to be exactly that percentage, but once you think it's heavy where it might be a limiter for you, okay, throw in the belt, get that work done in your heavy sets, your working sets, and then take it off again. So if we also think about this in terms of time of year, in your off season is a great time to really rebuild and repair a lot of the potential damage that we did maybe in your competitive season or like your really hard training time if you're a GPP athlete. But during those times of your off season, so to speak, you want to bring up the systems that are potentially going to be lacking in your body as a whole. So anything that you've neglected during your competition cycle, you want to be addressing now. So this could be as simple as doing more accessory work, whereas you were just doing more metcons before, or it could be something like take off your weightlifting belt, really focus on form and your engagement rather than just like the weight that you're throwing on the bar. So for each of these items, we really have to think about what is the purpose of this and what can I do to cycle this thing in and out of my training where I'm not necessarily reliant on it in case for some reason I don't get to use it. But at the same time, how is it actually going to aid my ability to be able to progress as well? So likely if someone is throwing on a belt and they're doing that at heavy loads where they can get maybe 20 pounds heavier than they could before, that's a way to overload that movement for them where now they're going to be able to lift more than they could before. And that's a great way to get stronger. Like it's really simple. If you lift more weight, you're stronger. So a belt, while it can potentially slow you down, can also accelerate your adaptation as well. So besides actually using it in strength, especially for CrossFit competitors, I highly recommend using a belt occasionally in metcons. So in a workout like 20.3, where it was heavy deadlifts and handstand pushups or handstand walks, I certainly recommend something like that, having a belt that you can easily get into and out of. So like one of those Velcro belts that are maybe like 4 or 6 inches thick and that have some give to them so that you can kind of loosen it and do your handstand pushups or handstand walks and actually leave it on your body. And then as soon as you get back to the bar, you cinch it back up and it's really easy. You don't have to like try to undo it like a lever belt traditionally, like a big kind of powerlifting belt. And that way it's not digging into you either, but at the same time, it does provide a bit of support, especially you can push against it and really brace and get an advantage from that for sure. Actually, several different belts. The one I recommend is just a Bear Complex 4-inch belt. For all the products that I mentioned here, I'm going to put them in the show notes. So that's zorfitness.com/podcast/011 in this case. So the episode number, go there and I'll list all the different products that I talk about today. So that's the belt I recommend if you're someone who is in the functional fitness space and going to be using a belt in metcons. I 100% recommend that style of belt. Next, let's talk about shoes. So starting off, this could just be your typical sneaker, your training shoe. And for training shoes, for someone who is in the functional fitness space where you're going to be lifting, you're going to be jumping, you're going to be running, like all these different things that you have to do. It's not just like you're in one discipline, like they're not just running shoes, like they're everything. So the two most popular brands are Nanos and Metcons, and there's some others like Nobles. And the thing with shoes is that it's providing protection, it's providing support, it's your base. So it's actually a really important, probably one of the most important pieces of equipment because it's something that you're going to be using the entire time. Whereas grips or a belt or some of these other things, it's like, yeah, you definitely use that, but it's not getting used the entire time, whereas shoes are being used the entire time. And I don't think you can really go wrong with any of these brands. My favorite shoe has been the Nano 6 because I think it worked really great for running and lifting combined. And it was a pretty minimalistic shoe. And I thought it was a kind of a good fit for me overall. So that's what I'll be linking to in the show notes. But I think any of the major brands do a pretty good job. So the biggest thing to look for in functional shoes is the fact that they are really stable. They're pretty flat. They're not super cushioned. So you don't want a super cushioned shoe when you're lifting heavy. Like that's not something you want. So if you've ever seen weightlifting shoes or cycling shoes, they're really rigid and hard to allow for transferability. So like you don't want a cushy shoe because you don't want it to be kind of like soft and pliable while you're trying to squat heavy or deadlift heavy with it. You don't want it to give much. You want it to be firm, just like your feet would be on the ground. And I think these functional shoes are actually a really good step up from the oversized cushion running shoes of the past. So here's my little rant on shoes. Imagine you had your hands, and your hands, you're always wearing mittens. That's the equivalent of what you do with your feet for a shoe. You're slipping your foot in, the toes are all smashed together, you can't really spread them out, they're all just kind of there and limp, and they're not really active or working. Imagine you wore mittens every day, all day. Within months, or certainly within several years, or certainly within your lifetime, if you're doing that every single day, day in and day out, the musculature in your hands and your dexterity in your hands and how you can move them, how you can use them would just diminish incredibly. That's exactly what happens with our feet. Our feet are filled with muscles. Our feet are filled with joints. Our feet move, they're elastic, they provide all these different qualities for us, and all those diminish if we're constantly wearing shoes. So we need to take time to actually take the shoes off, to be able to feel the ground again, to be able to preserve a lot of the natural function that we have with our feet. And if we take this and we take it to an extreme, that's what a weightlifting shoe is. So a weightlifting shoe, it's elevated in the heel, and that way it allows people to have a little bit more forward knee travel, which allows them to have a little bit more of an upright torso, which makes the Olympic lifts, snatch, and clean and jerk just a little bit easier. Oftentimes people, if they squat a lot in weightlifting shoes, they'll get like a little bit of knee pain just because they're tracking so much further forward, where they might not necessarily do that in flats. And then the other thing with the weightlifting shoes is that it is essentially a brace for your foot. It's no different than a belt is for your core. If you're wearing a belt, your entire session, every workout that you do, the whole workout, imagine how weak your core would be within even potentially months of you doing that. So if you wore a weightlifting belt every workout, imagine how quickly your core strength would deteriorate. Yet that's exactly what people do with weightlifting shoes. They put them on at the beginning of their session, they leave them on the entire session, then they do it every session. So you're already going from wearing like a mitten all day, and then you go straight into something that is a brace, which, yes, it allows itself for an advantage potentially, but over the long term, it can also lead to dysfunction. And the biggest thing is, if you're someone who is wearing weightlifting shoes, realize that it is a brace for your foot. It has a place. It can certainly help you lift more weight, and that can help you get stronger in the right context. But it can also make you be more fragile and be more susceptible to injury, and just to start to lack function as a whole. And that's something that you don't want as a human being. So if you are doing something to optimize for a certain position, like a snatch or a clean and jerk, that is fine. And that might be all well and good. But you just have to realize that it comes with consequences, and that at some point you have to undo the damage that you did or offset some of that by actually taking care of your feet. If you are someone who's not a competitor, there's really no reason for you to have a weightlifting shoe. I mean, it's fine if you kind of want that and you want to encourage yourself in the hobby of you weightlifting, but there's no reason that you need a weightlifting shoe. Whereas if you're a competitor, you want to optimize as much as you can through competition prep and through your actual competition so that you can lift the most weight possible. And there's times where you need to be able to lift in your training shoes during workouts. And there's also times where you can probably get away with wearing weightlifting shoes. Like there's scenarios where both of those are acceptable and one's going to be better than the other. But I would certainly recommend having weightlifting shoes as a competitor. For like max attempts and things where you're not actually in a Metcon, I love my Legacy lifters. I think they're a great shoe. And for actual Metcons, I actually prefer a much lighter shoe. So the Legacy lifters, they're a little bit heavier. They're definitely not as heavy as my Romaleos, the Nikes that I have, but they're certainly still pretty heavy. Whereas I have a pair of Innovate Fast Lifts, and they're a much more minimalistic take on the lifter, and I actually like them a lot for Metcons. Whereas if I'm doing something like a toes to bar, it's not going to add weight essentially to that. So let's talk about wrist wraps. Wrist wraps, you wrap them around your wrist just like it sounds, and they help support you when you're going overhead with heavy load. So whether it's a snatch, clean and jerk, an overhead squat, like any of those sort of movements. So I recommend these mainly for barbell movements like I just listed. People use them sometimes for like handstand push-ups or like other things like that. I don't necessarily recommend that near as much. I think the wrist is probably in a most compromised position in barbell movements, just because the weight is often kind of behind your wrist a little bit, puts a little bit more pressure on you. I certainly do not recommend using wrist wraps all the time when you're lifting. I know some people put them on in their warm-up sets and they don't take them off until like they're done with all their working sets. And I don't think that's a very smart model at all. The way I would do it is either putting them on a little bit at the beginning to get your wrist warm and to accelerate that, or to use them once your loading gets above a certain percentage when it's heavier again. Or on a particular day, you're just having a little bit more joint irritations, then okay, you can throw on your wrist wraps that particular day. But that shouldn't be an every single day thing that you're having to use them. So if you're having pain every single day, you need to address your movement, where maybe it's something with the shoulder that's going on, maybe something with this T-spine, maybe something with the lower body where you're not actually able to squat an upright torso and you're having to really be aggressive with your upper body position, and that's the reason why your wrist hurts. So go actually into why your wrist hurts rather than just trying to slap a Band-Aid on that. But I think wrist wraps are a fine thing to have as long as you don't use them all the time. I would say that's definitely an optional item here. So a side note on all kinds of other braces. So braces like ankle braces, knee braces, elbow braces. Number one, I think people rely on these mentally quite a bit, where it's something where like, oh yeah, I feel way better when I have this on. Like it's just kind of something where it's a mental crutch almost. And certainly there can be times where someone has a legitimate injury where those things can be useful. But in general, you don't have to rely on those things for the safety of your joints. And the other reason why you don't want to have to rely on these braces is because it's going to create upstream and downstream issues. So in other words, above or below that joint that's braced, you're going to create more issues because you're limiting the range of motion in that particular joint and you're making it more stiff, and something else is going to have to make up that ground. So for example, figure skaters had all these kinds of ankle injuries and they've ended up bracing all of their ankles so that they wouldn't have those ankle injuries anymore. And now a bunch of figure skaters just have knee injuries. Like it all just kind of moved upstream. The same thing happened with skiing. So skiing, you're in a boot. The boot has very little ankle range of motion. And imagine if your ski tip kind of got turned out to the side at like 90 degrees. Your ankle is actually going to be fine because it's in a brace. All that stress just goes upstream to the knee, and a lot of people have ACL tears because that's the exact motion that's going to cause that ligament to tear. So if you are bracing, realize that there is a benefit and a cost to that brace. And it's something that you just need to pay attention to and ask yourself, is that worth it for where I'm at now and where I'm going to be long term? Then next is wrist straps. So wrist wraps, where it's actually wrapping around your wrist to support you. Now wrist straps. So you actually connecting your hand to the bar. So it's a piece of like nylon cloth or leather or something where you can wrap it around the bar to assist your grip. And I do recommend athletes have wrist straps, especially people who are doing much more weightlifting work. Number one, if someone's doing a lot of volume, their thumbs potentially, if they're doing a lot of hook grip, might get irritated. If they're doing a lot of other gymnastics work, if say someone like tears their hand because they just did a bunch of gymnastics volume, then certainly having wrist straps allows that person not to have to hook grip, not to have direct hand contact onto the bar, and allows them to still get work in while they're working around that irritation. Just like all these other things that I'm mentioning, if you use it all the time and if you let it be a crutch where you're constantly using the wrist straps for all your heavy attempts or something like that, then you're probably going to have a grip limiter at some point in your future where you're going to be limited by your grip and heavy snatch or heavy hand cleans or something like that. But for athletes who are already getting a lot of grip work in and they're just doing a lot of gripping as a whole, which is certainly the case in CrossFit, then you're probably not really going to have an issue because you're pulling out some of that volume and putting it on the straps. I think it's fine. So for myself as an individual, I don't have an issue holding on to cleans near as much, especially full cleans or power cleans or squat cleans. I don't have near as much of an issue with that as I do with snatches. So number one, I don't recommend using wrist straps if you're doing any type of clean, like a full clean where you actually come up in the front rack versus like a pull. I do not recommend that you use that. Actually, I highly advise against using that. There's been a few athletes who are high-level weightlifters who have ended their careers because they decided to do that. If you miss a lift and this slips out of your front rack while your hands are attached to the bar, that's a really bad scenario. Whereas if you miss a snatch, you can drop it behind you or in front of you. So really, I recommend wrist straps for snatches and pulls and potentially heavy deadlifts where you want your shoulders to be symmetrical versus like a mixed grip or hook grip if your hands are beat up or your shoulders are kind of tweaky. And there's a specific style that I recommend for athletes that allows their hand to slip out easily if you do miss in a snatch. And that way it's easy to get in, but it's also easy to get out and it's not super thick. It's pretty comfortable. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. So then let's move into thumb tape. Thumb tape, just like the wrist straps, is going to aid an athlete in their grip. So for an athlete, this not only just protects the thumb, but it also provides a bit more tackiness and texture and something to really kind of grab onto the bar with. If you have not used thumb tape, especially for snatches, it's fine for cleans, especially if I'm doing like higher volume stuff to protect it. But again, if I'm actually putting chalk like all around my hand like I typically do, my grip is seldom a limiter for my cleans, whereas it definitely can be, especially if I'm sweaty during snatches. So I recommend wearing thumb tape for snatches. It just makes your grip a little bit less of a limiting factor. One of the reasons why snatch is a harder grip, if you pay attention to your upper arm orientation relative to the barbell, it's kind of at an angle, almost starting to go parallel towards it, versus with like a clean because your hands are basically perpendicular to the bar. So I actually started taping my thumbs fairly recently. I would say within the last training year that I actually started that. And the reason I did not do it before was because I had tried it and I just did not like how it felt. So I was using goat tape, which is a very adhesive tape, which is great, but it was not giving at all. So when I put it on, it cut off all the circulation to my thumb. And it was either put it on comfortably where it slid off after a while, or you put it on tight enough where it stayed, but then it cut off all your circulation. Also tried Coban, which is a stretchier tape, but when I put that on, it didn't have great adhesive, so it would slide off my thumb during the reps, which is just as bad. And then finally, I had the brand Lift Genie recommended to me, and that was something that really made the difference for me because it was not only slightly stretchy, but it also had all the adhesives. So you could really put it on pretty tightly, and it would stay in one place and not move. And yet it had some give to it, so you could actually move your thumb around and have some feeling and still get some circulation in there. And it was comfortable. I could wear it basically the whole session, and it wasn't an issue if I needed to. So if you're looking for thumb tape, that's what I recommend. It's called Lift Genie. So in that same vein, we could talk about K-tape or kinesio tape. I think it has very little value, to be honest. I don't recommend it for athletes just because I don't think it's worth the price, and I don't think it really has much of a performance benefit to it. I think most of the benefits are just perceived mental benefit. Next is gymnastics grips. And gymnastics grips are 100% something that I recommend every single athlete who is, quote, functional should have. If you do not have gymnastics grips, get a pair of gymnastics grips. I like the Bear Complex grips, in particular their 3-finger carbon grip. So it's both leather and carbon fiber, so it's a little bit thinner, which is great. I've had some other grips that are just a little bit thicker just because they're leather, and some people like those, but I don't really particularly like it. I like the thinner grip because I have more feel on the bar. And then the 3-finger just gives you a little bit more coverage, and it's a little bit less likely to rip. I actually changed my mind on that. I used to go 2-finger all the time, and I've moved to 3-finger. It's just a little bit more comfortable, and it's, I think, going to be a little bit more durable for me. So there's 2 different ways to actually wear my grips. Number 1 is actually put it through the finger holes like you see pretty much everybody demo it. But the thing I think people often don't get right with the grips is that there's supposed to be a fold over at the top where it actually goes around the bar and protects your hand the whole way across and also assists in you actually being able to hold onto that bar. Whereas a lot of people think it's supposed to just be flat against your hand the whole way across, and that's not the case at all. So most people get too small of a grip, or it comes and they think it's too big, but no, it's actually supposed to have that fold over the top. So if it is a workout where it's really gymnastics heavy and it doesn't have a lot of other pieces to it where I don't want the grips on, I actually put them through my fingers like that. I find it provides a bit more assistance for my grip. The other way that I'll wear the grip though, and this is like the case if I have a workout where it's like handstand push-ups or something where it's a pressing movement in particular, I like not having the grip on because I find it kind of bunches up and doesn't let me have full mobility for my wrist. So what I'll do, and I find a lot of other high-level athletes will do this at least part of the time as well, is they'll just not simply put their hands through the holes of the grips and they'll just kind of slap it over the top of the bar once they actually jump up. And it's just like they're kind of pinching it there, but it's not actually attached to their fingers. So some people use that technique exclusively. And I've seen especially some female athletes get really big grips, like say they have a small hand and they got like a large grip and they can just slap it over and it covers their entire hand. It's really actually pretty handy for them. And I've seen them have that be quite effective for themselves. So the reason I recommend wearing gymnastics grips is because unlike barbell work, where you can have a big spectrum of loadings, you could have 95 pounds in the bar, 135, 185, you go all the way up to a max effort for a single rep. That's not the case for gymnastics. And this is something I talked about in the very first episode 001 about gymnastics density. The reason that you have to do so many reps of gymnastics and that there's so much volume because the standardized movements in online qualifiers and as well as class settings is only so difficult. Like the hardest gymnastics skill out there in the sport of fitness is a muscle up. And because the hardest skill is a muscle up and we're not adding a vest, we're not adding strict, we're not making this up to a 1 rep max for the best athletes in the world, it is a repeatability thing. So repeatability, what that means is volumes. You're going to start to accumulate this volume. And the reason why people need gymnastics grips is because the volume of gymnastics in our sport is just so high. You're just going to get a lot of reps of gymnastics. And you need to protect your hands. If you tear your hands, that is an injury. If you have to adjust and change your program because you have a rip in your hands, that is an injury. So get a pair of gymnastics grips. It's that simple. So in the same vein, let's talk about chalk. Chalk just like everything else that I've already talked about, can potentially be a crutch for some athletes where they use the chalk bucket as a way to rest during workouts. They have to chalk between every single element of a workout. Like, it's one of those things where if they don't have chalk, they can't overhead squat, they can't do burpees. Like, it's such a pain when that happens. Don't be that athlete. Don't allow yourself to become reliant on chalk. However, just like wrist wraps or tape or any of the other things, it can potentially be a performance enhancer. I particularly recommend competitors actually buying their own chalk. The reason for this is so that if you are going to a local competition and you go there and you realize, oh, you know what? They didn't set any chalk out. Congratulations, you've just had a huge advantage over all of your competition. Likewise, if you don't necessarily know if in the middle of a workout that you're going to have a bucket right there with you, you can set your block of chalk there. So if you are a competitor, I do recommend you getting your own chalk. So what I found to be true for most people in chalk usage is if they're not using it as a way to kind of sandbag their workout or find a way to get a break in the middle of the workout, if they're truly needing it, it's because their hands are getting super sweaty. This was the case for me. I was like chalking up during like the humidity of the summer all the time. And it was just like because my hands were truly wet. The thing you can do to prevent this is wearing sweatbands. So putting a sweatband around your wrist so that the sweat stops from actually running down into your hands, and that way it doesn't mess with your grip in the first place. So what I'll do for maybe a typical online qualifier where it has an element of gymnastics with it is that I will put on sweatbands, number one, and I actually have some real sweatbands that I use. And I also have a bunch of youth-sized socks that I've cut off at like the foot, and they work really great because they're like double the width, and they fit great because like my wrist is probably the size of a child's leg, so it's perfect. So I'll put that on my wrist, and then I'll put my gymnastics grip, like the cuff of my gymnastics grip around my wrist, and then I'll chalk up my hands and also my grips. So I'm all chalked up and ready to go before the workout actually starts. I'm preventing any sweat from rolling down into my hands. So that way I don't have to go chalk up in the middle of the workout, and I can get through a workout like 20.2, which was a 20-minute workout, and never chalk up. That's what I actually did. And the other reason I like that is because, like I said before, where sometimes I'll just kind of drape that grip over the bar and not actually put it through my fingers. When I do that and just say I came off the bar and did a set of chest to bar and I dropped down and now I have some handstand push-ups or barbell work or something, I'll take it from the cuff and just spin it around to the back of my hand versus at my palm. And that way it's out of the way and I don't have to worry about trying to push it out of the way as I go to other elements, especially something like handstand push-ups or handstand walking. That's super helpful. And what that wristband does, it also provides a bit of protection as I slide that Velcro cuff of my gymnastics grip around the back of my hand. It doesn't irritate it because I might end up doing that maybe 40 times in a workout if it's a workout like 20.2, again, if I use that example. So I probably have a half dozen or maybe a dozen different pairs of sweatbands that I use that I can just throw on the wash, and that way I can have them throughout the week for my different workouts. So let's talk about knee sleeves. There's a few things that are kind of pet peeves of mine that people do with knee sleeves. One, putting them on and leaving them on the entire session, every session, not a good recipe at all. Number two is wearing one knee sleeve. So I really don't recommend people wearing one knee sleeve. So you're just perpetuating to yourself in your own head that you have something going on with one particular joint. Whereas if you can wear them on both or not wear it on either, that's a much better scenario because you are showing to yourself that you are symmetrical, just like you want to be. So if you are wearing knee sleeves, it's fine if you use it a few minutes in your warm-ups, just kind of until you're sweaty and then take them back off. Or it's fine if you warm up and then once you get to your heavier lifts, in particular exercise X that bothers your knees, throw them on. And then as soon as you're done with those, take them back off. And by the way, that particular exercise should be something that you feel comfortable doing without the knee sleeves on in the first place. It's fine if they aid you a little bit and maybe prevent some irritation, but at the same time, this should not be something where you feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't have my knee sleeves today, I can't back squat or something like that. It should be the case where those are maybe an addition to it, and it's fine if you use them on certain days, but you're not reliant on them. It's no different than the belt or the wrist wraps or anything else like that. Don't let it become a crutch. So one of the reasons that I recommend athletes having knee sleeves, especially if they are competitors, is for certain scenarios within workouts. So number one, if the workout just has really high volume and there's nothing you can do to avoid it, fine, just throw them on. The second thing that I recommend knee sleeves for is walking lunges or any sort of weighted walking lunge. And for competitors especially, you are trying to get through walking lunges as quickly as possible, and usually they're pretty lightly loaded. The standard for the walking lunge is touching your knee to the ground. And if you're trying to move through that quickly, that means that you're basically going to be slamming your knee into the ground again and again. Obviously, you're not trying to slam it in, but yet you still have to touch your knee to the ground. So just to meet the standard and to get through that quickly and just provide a bit of protection or cushion, I just do recommend people wearing knee sleeves for walking lunges. The third thing you can use a knee sleeve for is a shin guard for rope climb. So if you've ever done rope climbs in low socks where you didn't have any protection at all, you probably got a ton of rope burn. Having a knee sleeve in addition to maybe a long sock is going to be something that provides just a bit more protection and prevents you from damaging your tissues. So for knee sleeves, I recommend the Ray-Ban 5mm. That's my personal preference for thickness. They have a 7mm, they have a 3mm. I have actually all three of those. I think I have 4 different sets of knee sleeves, which is actually pretty nice because I actually wash them. Wash your knee sleeves, people. That's gross if you don't do that. It smells and everybody hates it if you don't wash your knee sleeves. So wash your knee sleeves. And I definitely recommend Ray-Ban knee sleeves, not the sunglass company. It's REHBAND. I think they probably have the best product on the market for knee sleeves. And the last piece of equipment I want to talk about today is the jump rope. The jump rope, if you are someone who is in functional fitness and you plan on doing double unders, whether you're a competitor or not, have your own jump rope. Go and buy your own jump rope. And this is something that I talked about in the last episode, episode 10, when I was talking about double unders. Imagine you come into the gym and every single day you're picking up a different piece of equipment. That's what you're doing when you don't own your own jump rope. The best thing that you can do when learning double unders is to use the same rope every single time. It's just going to allow you to do double unders faster. And as I'm thinking about people and getting jump ropes, I believe that a non-kink cable is totally worth the money. So when you take your coiled jump rope out of your gym bag and take it out of the container, a non-kink cable will kind of spring back to its original shape and it won't have any bends in it. Where I just had a Rogue kind of standard speed rope before, and it had all these kinks in the cable after a while. And if I was doing an online qualifier, I'd like set it out beforehand and like try to like smooth it out and try to get it all nice. Whereas now my RPM jump rope, I have the Session 4. I take it out of the bag and it springs open right to where it's at. And it's fantastic. I have just a raw cable where it's not coated anything. That way it spins really quickly. It's a pretty light rope, which is great for more advanced athletes because you can just spin it a little bit quicker. There's a little bit less friction there. I don't recommend getting a heavier cable just because you're a beginner. I think you'll be fine on that one. This just allows for consistency in a number of ways. And as a beginner, you just want as much consistency as possible. If we have a really advanced athlete, then we can consider adding some variance in where maybe you don't actually use the same jump rope every time, where might have some subtle differences in rope length or the consistency or the speed of which it spins, or you can maybe throw in like a weighted jump rope or a drag rope or some things like that. But that's for the advanced athlete so that they can be able to handle if they go to competition and they're not allowed to use their own rope. Like they're like, hey, we're going to give you your own double under rope and now you have to size it and get it ready like ahead of time, all that stuff. Or you just given like a drag rope that's a standard size. Those are all things for the advanced athletes to start to pay attention to and start to optimize for. But for most people, I just recommend actually going and buying their own jump rope so they can start to use it. So I think that does it for my list here. If you guys have any questions about any of the items in here, feel free to email me at ben@zorfitness.com. Again, if you go to the show notes at zorfitness.com/podcast/011, that'll get you to all of the products that I mentioned here and kind of that outline of the show and timestamps as well. So you can go back and listen to that again if you'd like. And I'll link out to all the different products that I mentioned. And a side note that I'm not sponsored by any of those. That's just the products that I actually use. So I know this was a little bit different of a show than I normally do, but I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. And as always, stay the course. And I truly appreciate all of you listening. In order for me to keep doing what I'm doing with the fitness movement, it's really important that I have people listening and following along with the podcast. That's how I'm going to be able to continue to do what I'm doing. So if you do enjoy these shows, please send them to your friends, your fellow fitnessers who would enjoy this type of content. And of course, it's always helpful if you leave a rating or review. Hey, it's Ben again. I want to talk for a moment about my program, Bulletproof Body. Bulletproof Body is an accessory program for CrossFit athletes. As you know, probably well aware of this, CrossFit is intense, and while that intensity can be effective, it certainly takes a toll on your body. I've seen this in countless athletes and, frankly, my own personal experience as well. I know I need to start doing more accessory work whenever I'm feeling just kind of burnt out and drained. My joints will start hurting, and I honestly just have a challenge keeping on muscle mass. And Bulletproof Body works specifically to counter all of these symptoms. Bulletproof Body is the perfect complement to traditional CrossFit style workouts. You don't have to stop your programming or classes because this program is meant to be supplemental. The goal here is to bring up some of the neglected areas in CrossFit. So the program focuses on 3 things. 1, adding size and strength, especially in muscle groups that are often kind of neglected or just not hit in CrossFit workouts. 2, improving your mobility and positions. We do this mainly through unilateral work and controlling the speed of the actual reps, so like tempo. And then increasing tendon and joint health, which is ultimately helping you avoid overuse and just those nagging injuries. So to learn more about the program, go to zorfitness.com/store or simply Google Bulletproof Body CrossFit.